Draped-seated woman is a bronze cast sculpture created between 1957 and 1958. It currently stands in Cabot Square in Canary, Wharf. For me, this is one of the most interesting Henry Moore sculptures in London. The source of its inspiration gives us an insight into Moore's life and career, and the sculpture itself has been on a journey which is very informative of the way in which society's attitudes to outdoor public sculpture have changed in the years since it was created. During the Second World War, Moore made sketches from the scenes he witnessed in the London Underground bomb shelters. He said that while he was down there, he had never seen so many reclining figures, and drew parallels between the tunnels of the underground and the holes he was interested in incorporating into his sculptures. If you look at the figures he drew in these shelter sketches, you will see great similarities between them and the draped-seated woman sculpture. The sculpture was sold to the London County Council in 1962 to stand in the newly built Stifford estate in Stepney Green. Moore was a supporter of the utopian ideals of post-war Britain, which promoted the arts for everyone, and so agreed to sell the sculpture for a fee of £7,000, which was only a third of its market value. Draped-seated woman, which became known as Old Flo by the people of the Stifford estate, was an important part of the community. It became a landmark that life in the estate revolved around. People would organise to meet their friends by it, and children would use it as a climbing frame. From the residents' testimonies, there is a feeling that the sculpture was very much an active part of the community rather than a detached, inanimate object. Draped-seated woman remained here until 1997 when the Stifford estate was demolished. It was temporarily moved to Yorkshire Sculpture Park for safekeeping, but ended up staying there for the next 20 years. In 2012, the Mayor of Tower Hamlets, Lufter Rahman, announced that the sculpture would be sold at a Christie's auction where it was expected to bring in £20 million. Budget cuts at the time had left local councils struggling to provide public services, and Rahman argued that the money could be better spent in other areas. This proved very controversial, and various public figures criticised the plans. It was argued that selling off cultural assets was not a solution to the budget gaps. Protests were held outside Tower Hamlets Town Hall, where protesters dressed up as Old Flo and held "not for sale" signs. The sculpture was more than just a valuable piece of art for many people. It was a connection to the area's history and a symbol of the post-war rebuild. The London County Council, which had originally bought the sculpture, had ceased to exist by this time, and a debate over who the sculpture actually belonged to was raised. Though a legal battle determined that Tower Hamlets Council were the rightful owners of the sculpture in 2015, Rahman had been removed by office by this time after being found guilty of electoral fraud. The plans to sell the sculpture were shelved by his successor, and in 2017 the sculpture was brought back to the East End and placed in its current position in Canary Wharf. It was said that this would only be a temporary home until 2022, when a more suitable home was to be found, but at the time of recording we are almost in 2024 and there are no signs of the sculpture moving. Draped-seated woman's current home in Canary Wharf has not been without criticism either. It's argued that the centre of 21st century corporate private land is such a far cry from the post-war utopian idea of the Stifford estate that it does a disservice to the sculpture for it to remain here. Perhaps the journey of this sculpture is representative of the changing attitudes to outdoor public sculpture in the years since its creation. Is there still a will to provide art of this calibre to ordinary people, or is it something that is reserved for a certain section of society? While looking at Draped-seated woman, take some time to consider some of these questions. Do you think Cabot Square is a good home? Would one of its previous homes or a different location be better? Do you see the similarities with the reclining figures in Moore's shelter sketches? Do you see any similarities between the form of this figure and the so-called primitive sculptures which inspired Moore?